It is April 30th, 1943. A Spanish fisherman pulls a body from the cold waters off the coast of Huelva, Spain. The man is dressed in the uniform of a British Royal Marines officer. Chained to his wrist, a battered leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase, letters. Official letters. Letters that would decide the fate of the entire Allied invasion of Europe. But here is what no one in the Spanish port knew that morning. The man had never existed. He had no mother, no father, no memory, no life. He was a lie. A carefully constructed, elaborately dressed, perfectly dead lie. And the Germans believed every single word. This is Operation Mincemeat, one of the most audacious deceptions in the history of warfare. A scheme so bold, so strange, so ruthlessly brilliant that it should never have worked. And yet it did. Completely. Totally. Catastrophically for the Third Reich. And at the center of it all was not a spy, not a general, not a double agent with a gun and a forged passport. At the center of it all was a dead man who had no idea he was even in the war. To understand how a dead man fooled Hitler's entire intelligence apparatus, you have to go back to late 1942. The tide of the war was beginning to turn. The Allies had cleared North Africa. The next logical step was obvious to everyone. Invade Europe through Sicily. Sicily was the natural stepping stone. The shortest crossing from Tunisia. The most direct route into the soft underbelly of Axis-held Europe, as Churchill himself would describe it. Every general on both sides knew it was coming. The Germans knew it. The Italians knew it. Rommel knew it. Kesselring knew it. And that was the problem. If the Germans fortified Sicily before the invasion, the cost in Allied blood would be catastrophic. The beaches would become slaughterhouses. The mission needed something more than firepower. It needed misdirection on a scale the world had never seen. It needed someone to look Hitler in the eye and lie. Two men were given the task. Lieutenant Commander Ewen Montagu of British Naval Intelligence and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of MI5. They were an odd pair. Methodical, creative, cold-blooded in the most necessary way. They came up with an idea so outrageous that their superiors almost laughed them out of the room. They would create a fictional British officer, give him a name, a rank, a history, a love life. Fill his pockets with the intimate clutter of a real human being. Then they would kill him, drop his body into the sea near Spain, let the currents carry him ashore with a briefcase full of false intelligence, and pray that German spies would intercept it before the Spanish authorities returned it to the British. The fictional officer was given the name Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. He was assigned a service number, a next of kin, a fiancée named Pam, whose photograph and love letters would be tucked tenderly into his breast pocket. He was given unpaid bills, a theater ticket stub, an angry letter from his bank about an overdrawn account, a receipt for an engagement ring. Everything a real man would carry. Everything that would make a spy lean forward and believe. But they needed something else. A real body. And this is where the story turns dark. Truly dark. In January 1943, Montagu and Cholmondeley were introduced to a man whose identity would remain classified for decades. His name was Glyndwr Michael. He was a Welsh vagrant who had died in London after accidentally ingesting rat poison. He was 34 years old. He had no family who could be located, no one who would ask questions. He was in the brutal calculus of wartime intelligence available. His body was kept on ice in a London mortuary while Montagu and Cholmondeley built the life around him. Layer by layer, letter by letter, detail by detail, Glyndwr Michael would become Major William Martin. He would be given a purpose in death that he never had in life. The letters inside the briefcase were the centerpiece. Not forged documents, not crude fabrications. Real letters, written by real generals, carefully crafted to mislead without ever seeming to try. General Sir Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote a personal letter to General Harold Alexander in Tunisia. The letter was chatty, casual. It mentioned almost in passing that the real Allied target was not Sicily at all, but Greece, specifically the Peloponnese, and as a secondary operation, Sardinia. Sicily, the letter implied, was merely a feint, a distraction. The Germans were meant to feel clever for seeing through it. The letter was a masterpiece of deception. It said just enough, implied just enough, and it was signed by a real general. On the night of April 19th, 1943, a British submarine, HMS Seraph, surfaced in the darkness off the Spanish coast near Huelva. The sea was cold. The stars were sharp. Lieutenant Commander Norman Jewell and his crew slid the canister containing Glyndwr Michael's body over the rail and into the water. The tide would do the rest. Before they submerged, Jewell read the 39th Psalm quietly to himself. They left the dead man to the sea. He washed ashore on April 30th. The Spanish fishermen who found him alerted local authorities. And here is where the operation came within a breath of total failure. Spain under Franco was officially neutral, but German intelligence had deep roots throughout the country. The local military commander, a man named Eduardo Infantes Blanco, was known to have connections with the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service. When the briefcase was logged and the body identified as a British officer, word moved quickly. Too quickly for the British consul's liking. The British, playing their role brilliantly, immediately demanded the return of Major Martin's effects. They were frantic, insistent, desperate in exactly the right way. Because if you want someone to believe a secret is real, you have to make them see you trying to hide it. The Spanish authorities officially returned the documents, but not before German agents had photographed every page. The letters landed on the desk of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr. Canaris was not a naive man. He was one of the most experienced intelligence operators in the world. He had his analysts scrutinize the documents. They checked the paper, the ink, the stamps, the names. Everything checked out. Everything was consistent. The letters were genuine. Canaris sent the assessment up the chain with a confident endorsement. They reached the desk of Hitler himself in late May 1943, and Adolf Hitler, Führer of the Third Reich, commander of the most powerful military machine in history, believed them absolutely. He ordered immediate reinforcements to Greece and Sardinia. Panzer divisions were redirected. Coastal defenses were reinforced along the Greek shoreline. Rommel was sent to Greece to oversee the defense. Field Marshal Kesselring was instructed to prepare for a landing on Sardinia. Sicily was left comparatively bare. On July 9, 1943, the largest amphibious invasion in history to that point struck the beaches of Sicily. 160,000 Allied troops, 3,000 ships, 1,400 aircraft. The Germans and Italians were caught almost completely off guard. The defenses were thin. The resistance in the early hours was shattered. Within 38 days, the entire island was in Allied hands. The road to Rome was open. German commanders on the ground were bewildered. Where were the reinforcements? Where were the panzers? They were in Greece, waiting for an invasion that never came, staring out at an empty sea while Sicily burned. The casualty figures tell the story in cold mathematics. Allied planners had estimated the Sicilian campaign could cost up to 50,000 dead. The actual figure was far lower. The deception had worked so completely, so surgically, that historians would later argue Operation Mincemeat may have shortened the war in Europe by months, possibly longer. Real men came home because a dead man delivered a lie. But the story does not end in 1943, not even close, because while the Allies celebrated the fall of Sicily and pushed north toward Rome, a quiet horror was unfolding in the files of British intelligence. Not a horror of defeat, a horror of what had been done and what could never be said out loud. The men who had planned Operation Mincemeat had used a human being as a prop, a man who had died in poverty, who had never been given the chance to refuse, whose body had been borrowed like a coat from a wardrobe. The deception was brilliant. The ethics were murky. And for more than a decade, no one outside a locked room in Whitehall was allowed to say a single word about England. For 12 years after the war, Operation Mincemeat remained classified. The families of the soldiers who died on those beaches never knew. The world never knew. Then in 1953, Ewen Montagu published a book, He called it The Man Who Never Was. It became a bestseller. A film followed in 1956. The story entered legend. Major William Martin became famous. Glyndwr, Michael remained a ghost. It was not until 1997 that a historian named Roger Morgan finally identified the real man inside the uniform. Glyndwr Michael, the Welsh vagrant, the man who had died alone and anonymous in a London warehouse, who had been used without consent, whose death was classified as a state secret for 50 years. The Ministry of Defense finally acknowledged the truth. A gravestone in Huelva, Spain, where the body had been buried, was updated with his real name. He had been lying there all along, unknown, unrecognized, under someone else's name. There is something in that image that refuses to leave the mind. A man who had nothing in life, no family who claimed him, no work, no shelter, no future, and yet his body, his death, his borrowed identity may have saved tens of thousands of lives. He did more for the Allied cause than most decorated officers. He did it without knowing, without choosing, without any say at all. Was it right? That question has no clean answer. The men who planned Operation Mincemeat believed they were saving lives. They probably were. Thousands of soldiers walked off those Sicilian beaches alive because a corpse had done the job first. Montagu carried the weight of it for the rest of his life, though he rarely spoke about the moral ledger. Cholmondeley the same. They were not cruel men. They were men at war, making the calculations that war demands. But the calculation had a human cost that no metal could balance. A man had been used, without consent, without dignity, without a name. What we're left with is this. In the spring of 1943, a dead man with borrowed love letters in his pocket, unpaid bills in his wallet, and a stranger's name on his uniform drifted ashore on a Spanish beach. He changed the course of a world war. He never fired a shot. He never gave an order. He never even opened his eyes. And yet the ripple of what he carried reached from a cold Spanish shoreline all the way to the Führer's desk in Berlin. And somewhere in the ruins of the German High Command, among the panzer divisions sitting idle in Greece, among the staffers who had double-checked the letters and confirmed them genuine, among the intelligence officers who had been outsmarted by a corpse, no one ever admitted they had been beaten by a man who never existed. History is full of great soldiers, great commanders, great battles won with blood and steel and sacrifice recorded in monuments and anthems. But perhaps the most powerful weapon ever deployed in the Second World War was a briefcase, and the man who carried it had been dead for weeks. His name was Glyndwr Michael. Remember it.